Some of you may remember Jeanie Clarke from the time when her, along with Steve Austin, had a famous feud, a couples feud, with Chris Adams and Toni Adams. Others may remember her from her run as Lady Blossom in 1991 in WCW. Of course, many of you may know her as the woman who came up with the name Stone Cold and put 316 into Steve Austin's head. Well, she has recently written a book, Through the Shattered Glass, by Jeanie Clarke, along with Bradley Craig and Neil Cameron, and she is with us here today on the Superpodcast. Jeanie Clarke. Jeanie, how are you?
I'm doing fine, and I'm very, very grateful for you having me on the show.
We're very grateful to have you here. You're a name I hadn't heard in a while, so I was delighted when I heard you wrote a book, and what an interesting book it is, and we'll get into that here. But at the top, let me ask you, when did you decide to write a book, and was this something you ever thought you would do?
No, actually not. Obviously, when I came back to the UK about 15 years ago, I was a little bit ill, as you know, and I never ever had any thoughts on writing the book at all. But in my book, I will, go into the details of being quite ill for all those years. And whilst I was in rehab, after some really bad addiction problems, we were taught via the counsellors, part of the process of healing was writing things down. So when I came out of rehab, I would jot all these notes down and self-reflect and look back over my life. And I got so much written down, I thought, wow, this is a good idea to write a book, mainly for myself and my family and my children. And I didn't actually think anybody would read it, to be honest, but I was thinking it would be really therapeutic for me and also for my girls to really understand everything that happened in the past. So it was just the reason I did it was therapeutic after I finally got well again after many years being an addict.
That's one of the striking things about your book is just how candid and how honest you are in things that happened around you as well as your own personal faults at different times. The honesty is breathtaking, quite frankly, with this book. And of course, I'm speak for everyone. I'm sure that I'm happy you're in recovery and that you've got your addiction under control right now, and that's tremendous, and we wish you continued success with that. One of the first things I noticed with your book was you have Kevin Von Erich writing the foreword, and Missy Hyatt wrote the introduction. Obviously, you worked with Missy in WCW for a brief time in 91. You were around Kevin, I would guess, a little bit, but what was the process in getting them involved in the book?
Actually, Neil Cameron, who is one of my co-writers, thought it would be a nice addition to add into the story. So it actually was his idea. And when I was thinking of somebody to write forward, I was thinking Kevin obviously was really close to Chris and knew Steve via the World Class. And I had known Kevin before I started working just because I was friends with Chris. And obviously a lot of tragedy happened within his family. And I thought he would just be the perfect person to write the forward. And I gave him a call. I phoned him up and he said, "How can I help you?" I was really, really grateful to him for sitting down and writing 5 pages for my forward. Missy and I are friends. We've always been friends. We still are friends. And I talk to her periodically, but I asked her if she would give a different view, because the view with Kevin was more on addictions and Chris, and I just thought Missy, would give a bit more of a light-hearted intro, and then from there we kind of, because not many people knew that I actually started in the business when I was 19 with Chris. A lot of people, I don't know though, but I think a lot of people in the States may not remember back with the World of Sport wrestling. I know some people would, but they used to have it on TV here in every Saturday. Extremely popular show. And I thought with a few of the wrestlers of that era, like Mark Rocco and Mighty Jones, some of the people that I work with, would be great, just to add to the story and any memories they had of Chris at that time. And I thought these little quotes, added really good, interest into the story for people that would remember Chris, back in the 70s even. So I just thought it was really cool to have the quotes in there. But Neil Cameron was the one who came up with the idea, and I really liked it. I thought it was a good idea.
Yeah, I think so too. I think it added a lot to the book. And, one of the cool things nowadays is with YouTube, so many of us here in America are exposed to World of Sport. We do get to see all these guys that we had maybe heard about or maybe read about. We all knew Chris, we all knew Dynamite Kid, and even Giant Haystacks to a point. But, now we can go back and we can see all these other wrestlers on YouTube, and it's a different style and it's an exciting style. Yeah. Yeah.
And when I started, obviously, because they have the rounds in the UK, what I did was be a second because they had the rounds like boxing. So I would just come in with water and a towel like you'd see in a boxing match of a second, and there wasn't any sort of interference like what I did in World Class, but it was an incredible experience because I did know Tom Billington when he was my age and just starting out, and Davey Boy Smith was another, and I knew those guys before they ever really made it, and just to be around the World of Sport crew was to me was just amazing. So when I came to the States, obviously I'd had a little bit of experience of working the road with some of the crew here.
You got to wonder what a fan from England who saw you as a second for Chris Adams early on thought when they finally saw this diabolical Jeanie Adams character, at ringside in Dallas causing all sorts of trouble.
I tell you what, Chris was brilliant at creating that character because he did. And I remember him calling me up actually when I was living in Florida, and he said, I've got this idea. And I think a lot of the idea came from when not Missy was doing it, but Precious and Sunshine, and they had the girls' feud. I think he kind of was trying to recreate that with the storyline that was sort of had a bit of reality in it because I really was his ex-girlfriend. We were never married, Chris and I. A lot of people think Jeanie Adams was actually, a fictitious character because Chris and I never actually married, or we were boyfriend and girlfriend for a long time. But he said to me, I want you to go and watch Joan Collins on Dynasty. So he said, because wear that kind of all those sort of dresses, and I would watch it, and, just be like that. But he was really good at giving me direction, and I knew what to do before I went out. And he'd say this, say that. I'd be, oh my God, I can't say that. I did. and it was great.
And we'll definitely get into that a little more in this interview, especially, one of the things I want to talk about. Everyone knows, everyone has seen the high points of Chris Adams' career, and everyone certainly knows of some of the outside of the ring troubles he had. But your book, more than anything else I had ever read, really kind of pointed out that he had a creative mind for the wrestling business beyond being in the ring. But just in terms of ideas and things he wanted to do, it seemed that his brain was always going with ideas for wrestling.
Yeah, he would have been a great booker. He really would. He did start running his own promotions, but he had a great mind for wrestling. He was a bit of a Jekyll and Hyde character when he was drinking. I mean, when he wasn't drinking, he was completely, business all the way, very well organized, always on time, like if he had appointments, and he always kept everything neat and tidy in his office and that. But, when he had a few drinks, it just, he had problems then. But I remember him being extremely clever, very intelligent. And, and I think, a lot of the trouble with Chris is that he kind of, we came from England and like other people, they start earning money and think they could, start acting, you get all the girls and stuff like that, and they start acting a little bit, I want to say like rock stars, but I think a lot of it was everything happened so quick for Chris in world class, and he made a lot of money and he blew a lot of money, and then when towards the end he was penniless, and he couldn't get a job because a lot of the, bigger companies saw him as a little bit, because of his problems. I don't know the right word I'm looking for, but maybe unpredictable.
Yeah, maybe some reliability issues, I guess would be the best way to put it.
Yeah.
Well, let's take a step back, and you correctly point out that wrestling is very akin to rock and roll in terms of being a rock star, the adulation, the going from town to town, the performance. And, one of the things you talk about in the book, and we're going to briefly get into this before we get into more wrestling-related topics, but you mentioned that when you were young, you got to go see David Bowie and Slade and Queen and David Essex, the height of glam rock in England.
Yes.
As my listeners know, I'm a big fan of that, but I'm also a big fan of punk rock. And I just had to ask you before we go forward, you were the right age. What did you think of punk rock, and were there any bands on that scene that you liked?
There's a road in the UK called the King's Road in Chelsea, and that's pretty much where it started. And me and my mates, we would go with all the mohawks and we would just love dressing up. And yeah, we went to see the Sex Pistols.
Oh, wow.
Which was, do you remember they had God Save the Queen, that massive hit?
Of course.
I mean, we loved it. It was a great time to be young in the late 70s in the UK. It really was, because we would go down, to the King's Road, and you just wanted to hang out there because that was where everybody went, and it was just great.
Yeah, it truly was almost like a youth explosion during that time where,
Yes, yeah.
But, getting to wrestling, you mentioned in the book how you were at a girlfriend's house and her father was watching TV, and that was your first exposure to wrestling. And then you end up going with her to a show, and it's at that very first show where you meet Chris Adams. What were your first impressions of Chris, and what was he like at that point in his life?
Well, just really sweet. And that's true because my friend's father, I can remember going to her house and I would always hear wrestling going on in the other room while we were sitting in the kitchen. He got ill, but he used to have tickets to the show that went on every month. And because he couldn't go, she said, "Oh, come on, let's just go." And I just remember he looked a little bit like Paul McCartney because he had these really cute dimples. And he was, he was really nice looking, and he just came up. And I didn't think he would call me back because I thought, yeah, he's just going to take my number. But he did. He kept calling and calling. And we very quickly moved in together after that. We didn't date for very long, and obviously we came to the States together, but he taught me a lot, because I had a bit of a bad childhood and I was a bit of a wild child myself, but he would always say, "No, let's go to the gym and let's eat this healthy." It was really, really, really good for me at that time, and I ran his fan club for him and paid the bills and sent out all the pictures. And so I had what I would say is more structured routine, which was good for me. And I looked up to him as somebody who was just looking out for me, and I felt, really loved by him. And I loved him. I really did. I was very much in love with Chris at that time.
Well, you guys are living together, you're running his fan club, you're traveling to shows with him and some of his colleagues, and eventually you do second him at the ring. Like you said, Chris was a good-looking guy. What did the other women in attendance think of, this beautiful woman coming out with Chris Adams, who, you guys wanted him to be thought of as single because it would help with the crowd, correct?
Yes. I don't know, really, because nobody ever, did. Most of the fans and even the women were just really nice to me. I didn't really think anything of it, really. I didn't get jealous or anything like that. I was with Chris mainly all the time, but, you know, later on he did start, well, you know, he at that time he was with me sort of 24/7, but later on he did sort of get the urge to be tempted, and he did get tempted, and that is why we split up, because I got a child by then, Jade, who was born, and I felt like a bit betrayed by Chris at that time. Chris and I did stay friends, and we made a great friendship. But like I was trying to say, once, you know, all the girls in mainly the Portland territory, when all the girls were sort of chasing him, then he started to sort of stay out all night, and phone calls and stuff were coming, and then, you know, obviously the relationship started to have cracks in it, because he was very good looking, and he did have a lot of girls after him, and that was the time that he started to sort of go out with them, I guess, sleep with them and stuff. So, you know, so he was young though. He was young and 23, 24 years old, and, you know, I'm sure that was a lot of pressure on him as well. So.
Sure. Let me take a step back. I want to ask you something that I'm fascinated with, and I think you may have a different perspective on it. You know, you point out in your book that the biggest star in England at the time was Big Daddy, Shirley Crabtree. And of course, his brother was Max Crabtree, the promoter. I mean, a nice little relationship there if you want to stay on top.
Yeah.
You know, there's been a debate over the last several years, especially, about whether Big Daddy should be in the Wrestling Observer Newsletter Hall of Fame. It's the most widely respected Hall of Fame. It's voted on by wrestlers and reporters and historians. And I'd like to know what your thoughts are. And I'd also like to know, all those times you were in the car with Chris and other wrestlers going from show to show, what did they think of Big Daddy?
Yeah. I don't recall a lot of really bad things said about him. I think he was really, really, really loved by, you know, the fans. As a matter of fact, the Queen was meant to be a fan of him. Can you imagine that?
Wow.
Honestly. So, you know, I can't imagine her watching it, but apparently she was. And I think the Wrestling Observer too, you know, obviously I think that's a fantastic, Dave Meltzer and Brian, I mean, their journalism is absolutely brilliant. And I think perhaps that would be a good thing for his family here in England, sort of have a nice award, you know, because people forget these guys. I mean, you know, even at the reunions that they have here, I mean, they don't really, no one really remembers them anymore. So I think it would be nice for their kids to, as well, to feel like somebody, you know, appreciates that early work that they did over here.
Yeah.
As far as the boys, I don't actually recall a lot of them in my presence, to be honest, mentioning how they felt about Daddy personally. So, but I didn't meet him an awful lot, but I know, you know, he was over massively, and like I say, Brian was his brother, but you know, he would have helped the audiences because he was just massively over with the fans.
Yeah, it shows you the difference in generations. The Queen liked Big Daddy and Princess Diana liked Duran Duran. So it shows you right there.
Yeah.
You know, going to all those shows, who was your favorite guy to watch Chris wrestle in England? Did you have a favorite opponent to watch?
I thought I always liked Mark Rocco, and I always thought Mark Rocco was an amazing worker. And he had great matches, and obviously Tom Billington was a great worker. As he went on to be phenomenal, didn't he? And I think Chris, you know, he was fairly green, you know, wasn't that long, but he did like to do, he did like the guy that came over from Japan called Yasu Fuji, because he had the martial arts background and was the one who actually got Chris the job with the LaBelles, because they had a judo background as well. So, Chris really liked the guys, that could help with the judo.
When did he start doing the super kick? Was he doing that from the start?
Yeah, he started the super kick. Yeah, it's definitely him who, yeah.
Yeah, but was he doing it from the beginning of his career?
I believe he was doing it in the UK, but I'm not 100% sure. But I remember I think he did that. Yeah, he did that straight away. Yeah, I think a few guys followed him on that, didn't they?
I mean, and no one's done it as effective as him. I always say it on the show. Other people stand in the corner and kind of set it up and telegraph it, and then it's delivered at a slow pace. He would stand in the middle of the ring, and it was just like a lightning bolt. It was so fast and so impactful. It's still to this day, I think, no one's done it as good as Chris Adams.
He was in the British judo squad. I mean, his brother was a silver medalist in the Olympics. So, he was a really experienced and trained judo guy. So that's probably why, because he would have learned that since he was about 11 years old. He started doing that.
You mentioned his brother Neil, a well-respected athlete, a well-respected judo player. Was there much competition between the brothers?
I think there was a little bit, but Chris loved Neil so much. I think what it was is Neil was 4 years younger than Chris, and I think Chris just accepted that his brother was just a little bit better at judo than him. But I think what Chris wanted was his family, like his mum and his dad, to say, look, I'm doing wrestling now. So he wanted to branch off and for them to be proud of him as a wrestler. And Neil was the judo guy, but I don't think they took the wrestling quite so seriously in his family, and I think it caused him a lot of frustration.
I'm sure it does. And you mentioned that eventually you would get the call and you get to go work for the Hollywood promotion, the LaBelle brothers, of course, Judo Gene LaBelle, a famous tough guy, and Mike LaBelle, who very few people have anything good to say about. But Chris gets the opportunity to go over there, and he brings you with him. What was it like for you to come to the States, and what was Los Angeles like at that time?
Well, you can imagine I was like 19, 20 years old, and I'm in Los Angeles, and Chris and I both, we were so in awe. We would like go to the beach. It was like, wow, all the time, And even though we were broke, very poor, because what we didn't know is that the job he had with the LaBelles was on a Friday night, I believe, at the auditorium, the Olympic auditorium, but he didn't really have too many spot shows. So we had a bit of savings, but we got like $40. So I obviously started to work what work I could do. And, but it didn't really matter because we were so in awe of, we walked down Santa Monica Beach and Santa Monica Pier, and there was no question that we wanted to go back to the UK. We wanted to stay there, and the weather was nice and everything was better than where we were at here. So we loved it so much.
Yeah, I mean, you point out in the book that even though you guys were broke and there were days where you guys actually slept on the beach, those are some of the happiest memories of your life.
Yeah, because we would just like go in the ocean. We had a couple of surfboards and we would lay there, and we loved it, because we were young and we were just so excited to be in Los Angeles. But they were happy days, yeah. I was very fond of those days.
Chris goes over there. It's a great opportunity to get out of England and try to become a star in America. And unfortunately, those are really the dying days of the Los Angeles promotion. There was very little money. The crowds were down and down and down. And eventually the promotion shuts down, by the end of '82, I believe.
Yeah.
Was it a frustrating experience for him, or, you know, what were his hopes? Were his hopes to make it there, or did he want to right away just go somewhere else and take his star with him somewhere else?
Yeah, there was no question about wanting to come back to the UK. Did not. Matter of fact, he went down to Mexico, and then after that, obviously he got picked up to go to Portland, but he did not want to go back to the UK.
You know, and Portland's an interesting place, especially at that time. It's a rather small territory in terms of the roster size, but there was always a lot of things going on. And, you know, also, as you pointed out earlier, it's known as a wilder territory, whether it's drugs or alcohol or women. It was one of the wilder territories with a lot of wild wrestlers working there. You know, you mentioned earlier in this interview some of the troubles that happened in your relationship when you guys were in Portland. But one of the things I found really fascinating in your book, and I'll ask you a follow-up question to this shortly, because I'd always heard different stories, and you cleared it up. I had always heard that, you know, Jeanie had a relationship with Billy Jack Haynes, and, you know, later on it caused problems with, you know, Chris and Billy Jack, which I'll ask you about shortly. But I never realized the extent of it, where you actually married Billy Jack Haynes to become an American citizen.
Yeah, that's right. What happened was we went up to Portland, and we had it's kind of a studio apartment. It wasn't very nice, but the thing is, in LA, for me, is I was working, and I would walk down to Santa Monica Pier, where I worked at a place called Moby's Dock, and I was also modeling, but also there was so much public transportation along, I think it was Ocean Avenue where we were, and there were buses and places to go. So bearing in mind I had a child as well, so a lot of the bit of depression that sat into me when I first got to Portland was where we were at. There was no transportation and no chance for me to work, because, you know, LA, I had the modeling, and also, you know, just having a baby. So I didn't mind that so much. But what happened was, you're right, there were a few people that came into Chris's life who, now I never knew, and I swear to God, I never knew Chris to ever use drugs. Yes, he liked a few pints after, especially in the UK, you'd have social drink after the matches. And LA, you know, it didn't really have a problem with alcohol, to be honest. He had a few drinks, but when we got to Portland, there was a couple of people that would hang around. One guy, his name was Ralph. Everyone called him Dirty Ralph. He was the weed up. They had a lot of weed up there, and I saw sort of the first inklings of drugs in the industry up there. And although Chris and I sometimes would go out together, it seemed I was feeling a little bit neglected, if I'm honest. But what happened is he started to enjoy having these parties where there was a lot of girls and drugs. And what will happen is sometimes I would be in the apartment and I had no car to get out, and feeling a bit isolated up there. But he wouldn't come home for a couple of days, and I didn't know where he was. And he didn't have like mobile phones back then, you know, but he never actually phoned me. And so I was getting really disappointed with the relationship, and basically came back to England for a little while. And then I kept getting these phone calls from different girls. I remember their names and everything. And then I would ask Chris about them, and he would, you know, kind of have a guilty look. And basically I knew that he was, you know, using a lot of weed, and he was sleeping with a lot of girls. And one day I was so despondent and feeling so isolated and disappointed. And Billy Jack said, you know, he knew that was happening. And he said to me that Chris had told him a few things about the other girls. And I said, I don't know what to do, because I actually have no choice, because I have no green card, because I was getting cash for my work that I was doing in Los Angeles modeling. It was just I'd get paid cash, and I had no car, and as much as I kept asking Chris to stop, at that time he was really caught up in it, And so, you know, basically I was wanting to either go back to England. I mean, I didn't think there was any hope left for Chris and I, but Billy sort of offered me a helping hand, and he said he would, you know, help me out. But it wasn't like, I did have a lot of feelings for Billy, but at the time he was the only person I could really talk to, because I didn't have anybody to talk to. And to be honest, he just helped me out. I don't think that we had enough love to have a huge future together. But, you know, it's kind of survival on my part as well. But, you know, I have spoke to Billy, actually, not that long ago, maybe 2 or 3 months ago. He sent me a message, and he was very kind to me. And we did end up getting a divorce, but we've been very amicable. If we ever get to speak, we're quite amicable. But it was just, that was the first time that I was just with Chris, where it was sitting in the apartment 2 or 3 days, and he'd go to a party and then he wouldn't come home, and another party. And I just, you know, got very depressed with it all.
Yeah, you know, Billy Jack has become somewhat of a controversial figure around wrestling, and that's why I found that section in the book so interesting. Was just you point out just how tender and loving and caring he really was for you when you needed someone to be like that.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know, you know, about the controversy. I don't know what's going on right now. I can only go on my story. It was at that time, 1983, that he supported me, you know, helped me get driving lessons, and he was, you know, nice to me. So, you know, I don't know anything that's gone on since.
I want to ask you a couple more questions about him. One is, I'm trying to think off the top of my head, was he in WCW as Black Blood when you first arrived there with Steve? Did you run into him there?
Yes. Yeah, I didn't see him for very long, but he did come in, yeah, and we were fine.
The other one I have to ask you about, and it's a story I've heard a few times from Jim Cornette, who's a friend of mine, and I also co-host his show, his podcast.
Oh,
yeah. And I believe you're about to see him in Charlotte, so you tell him I say hello.
Yeah, he's a great talker, isn't he? I'm excited to meet him, by the way. Very. I mean, I think he's fantastic at what he does. Yeah. But...
I'm sure he'd love to hear that. You know, he has brought up a story several times when he first started in Dallas. He went from Mid-South to Dallas. He was sent there by the office. They lined up the dates for him. That was right when I guess the attempt was being made to make Kerry Von Erich a movie star, and he went out to Hollywood for a short period of time for auditions. And Billy Jack was brought into Dallas to replace Kerry, or the attempt to replace Kerry, in that top babyface role. And at that same time, Chris was there as a heel, and Jim tells the story that there was a night where it was supposed to be Billy Jack versus Chris for the TV title, and Chris didn't show up because he was afraid of what would happen with Billy Jack. And I guess it would all be stemming from the relationship with you. Do you know anything about this?
No, I did hear that, to be honest. I did hear Jim Cornette's interview. What he said that was a little incorrect, and he said he didn't know if he got it right anyway, was that I was Billy Jack's girlfriend and I'd gone to Dallas with Chris. But actually, I was Chris's girlfriend from years earlier. And Billy was after, you know, a relationship I had after Chris. But what happened was I went back to England, and Billy, I thought, you know, Chris went to World Class, and Billy, I thought, went to Florida. And I swear to God, I never knew Billy even went into World Class. So whether Chris ran out of town or not, I really don't know. I've never heard that story, but I would have thought there would have been a little animosity between Billy and Chris, yeah. So it's possibly quite true. But I was in the UK, so I didn't know any of that until I heard it.
Billy wrestled in Dallas for a short period of time. You know, it was during a period of time where he wrestled various places for short periods of time. But, you know, going back to you, you're now in England. You have a young daughter, and her father is in Dallas. And eventually you end up there as well, you end up in the same complex as Chris with his new wife, Toni Adams. What was that whole thing? I mean, was there ever, I mean, it seems like everything worked out because you and Toni were great friends and you and Chris had a good relationship, but were there any moments of unease of just, you know, this, it's a very unique, almost sitcom-like setup.
Yeah. I mean, see, yeah, see, when I left Chris and then I was in a relationship with Billy, what happened was, I went back to the UK, and then Billy and Chris would both phone me while I was in the UK. And obviously, because I had a child with Chris, I kept in contact with Chris, but we didn't argue, Chris and I. It was a unique relationship. It really, really was. And so I was in Florida because I went to Florida because Billy was there, and Billy had set me up with an apartment, and we actually arranged to get an uncontested divorce, and we were very amicable. So Chris phones me up and he goes, hey, he said, I've got a wrestler called Gino Hernandez, and why don't you come to Dallas because I've got this great ex-wife angle. Now, at that time, I didn't actually say yes, and I think they put Baby Doll with Gino, and obviously, then Chris said to me, well, come to Dallas and we'll share the, parenting of Jade. And because I had come out of another relationship, I said, okay. And Chris actually got me an apartment there, but we just didn't have any animosity towards each other, Chris and I. We were almost like brother and sister. And so Gino obviously died, and then I went about my own business in Dallas, and then Chris calls me up and he goes, he said, I think there's this student I have, Steve Williams, who I think he has potential, and I really want to do this ex-wife angle. But Toni and I were really good friends by now because we used to go shopping together. We just clicked. And so the chemistry between all four of us was really good, so that's how I met Steve. A lot of people are amazed, like, how come you and Chris, but we just got along. Maybe Chris realized, he was wrong in what he did to me, and but it never stopped us being friends.
You mentioned Gino Hernandez. Gino is a very popular topic on my show. I feel, and it's a good thing, more and more people are starting to realize and appreciate just how good he was, just what a natural he was. And I didn't realize that you and him have had the relationship that you had until I read your book. What was Gino like, to be around? What kind of guy was he outside of wrestling?
Well, I didn't know Gino for long because I got to Dallas not too long before the famous hair versus hair match. And I wouldn't say that I really knew him very well that night because I was invited by Chris and Toni to go to that match. But after the match, Chris, Toni, Gino, and I all went out that night, and that's when Gino had a bald head, or he just had his head shaved, and everybody was partying, really hard. And I wrote about this, didn't I? The thing is that because Gino also lived in the same complex, that Chris found me an apartment. So actually we were all neighbors. I lived next door to Gino. And so I saw him on a daily basis, even, just because we lived next door to each other. And often I'd pop in and have a cup of tea. I say a cup of tea, a cup of coffee. And we hung out sort of. So I saw Gino the week before he died. And I wrote in my book some pretty sad stuff that happened that night, Yeah. And then I was right there on the day he died, and I actually saw, them bring his body out. And I for about 6 months, I felt so numb. Afterwards, I felt I couldn't, really enjoy living there anymore. So I moved out, and like I say, I only knew him for about 3 or 4 months, and I did see the level of cocaine he was taking and stuff. But sometimes he would snap out of it, and other times he'd get really paranoid. And I just remember him having like a huge cereal bowl, and like a big bowl. He'd open the cupboard and he'd put his hand up in the top of the cupboard and pull out a bowl, and it was full of cocaine. And I just remember the amount he was taking was extremely high.
If you listen to anyone who worked that territory at that time, any old interviews or current interviews, from Kevin Von Erich to David Manning to Gary Hart to everyone seems to have a different theory. And no one says the exact same thing. So I'll ask you, you lived next door, you knew him, you certainly saw, as our listeners can see in your book, your wonderful book, Through the Shattered Glass, you could see the stories that you write about Gino and his paranoia. Do you think Gino overdosed, or do you think there was something else at hand?
I think he overdosed, because the week before that I was with him, I told you he poured it. Well, I didn't tell you. Excuse me. I wrote about in my book, the gun incident and everything that was going on. He did keep looking out the window, but then I think that's paranoia. But the very night he died, I saw him earlier, because he'd just come in and he said to me, "I'm going to pop out tonight," and he had this pie in his hand, and basically I saw that he came home around 2 a.m. and his wheels of his car were, he was parked really bad, so it wasn't like he was a bit careless how he parked, and the next morning, the car was still there like that, but there wasn't anything dodgy going on around the apartment. I didn't hear anything. I actually was knocking on the door for a little bit, because, another night went by, and I said to my friend Vicky, who was a friend that lived with me upstairs, I said, "I think something's really wrong with Gina." But I was at where we were knocking on his door, and obviously he had passed away inside. We were sort of frightened at that time, just really frightened to call the police, because, whoa, what if he's asleep and he's got cocaine and we get him put in jail? And it was just, a decision that we made not to call the police. And the next thing was I saw David Manning, but I didn't see any or hear anything that I think he OD'd, because I saw the amounts he was taking. It was crazy amounts. And the policeman that came said to me that he'd fallen down face first like a tree right to the end of his bed, and then his body was at the end of the bed, but there wasn't any. I'd gone into his apartment and there wasn't any. I don't think it was anything suspicious. I think he took too much and he OD'd.
How did his death affect everyone else? I mean, how did it affect Chris? Because they had gotten very close.
Oh, it was awful. Yeah, because they had done this angle, didn't they, with the blinding. Yeah. And I was the one that actually, Chris was in England at the time at his mum's. And I remember, Tony answered the phone, and I told her, and I just remember a scream, and Chris is like, yeah, it can't be real. I mean, we were all sort of not ourselves for months. I wasn't, because I had to pass his apartment and go into mine right next door, and it just affected me so bad. I ended up moving out.
Around this time, too, Chris ends up getting into some legal trouble. There's an incident on an airplane with a stewardess. When something like that happens, how does it affect you? You being the mother of his child, you living close by, your daughter was still young enough that she wouldn't, see that in the newspapers or anything. But does it raise a concern for you?
Yeah, because, Chris was really getting out of control, and he had the problem with Tony as well, and he'd gone to jail. But, the thing is that he feels so much remorse after, like if he was drinking and something happened and he lost his temper and he then he'd come crying. Like, he phoned me up from jail and he goes, "Oh my God." And he asked me if I'd come and bail him out of jail. I didn't actually put this in my book because I've just remembered it. And he had like cuts on his hand, and what the knuckle on his hand was like a massive, great big, but basically what I'm saying is he had a staph infection in his hand. And I said, "Well, you need to just, sort that out." And he'd cry and he'd cry and he'd cry because he kind of blacked out when he gets into sort of these bad, where he hurts people, and he'd feel remorseful afterwards, and sort of like he couldn't remember what happened. The thing is that he just had that thing where something like that would happen. Someone say, "No, you can't do that," or this, and he just lost his temper. But then when he sort of came back round, he'd cry so much, and so it's just really sad to see him go down like that.
You summed it up best earlier. It was a Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde situation. As soon as he had, as we've heard from other people, just a few drops of alcohol would do it, it seemed.
Yeah. And he'd be very unpredictable. And someone could say something small to him, and it could snowball so easily. And I think that's what happened when he actually got shot. Is I knew the guy that shot him, Brent Parnell, I think his name, and he was really good friends with him, really, really good friends with him. I mean, they lived together. They came to my house about 5 months before he died, when I was still living in Dallas, and they were just laughing and joking. And the thing is I think Chris had gotten really frustrated with his lawsuit that he had with the girl that died from GHB, and he'd just got into a silly argument, and things all got crazy, and it's just seemed over nothing. So he died because of alcohol, really, and his temper. And then Brent, not being a really bad guy, he wasn't. He just thought Chris would kill him, and he probably had good reason to think that. When Chris got angry, he's quite scary. A lot of people were frightened of him, so he had a big gash on his forehead when at his funeral, on his forehead, where Bure had taken the back of the gun and he'd hit him on the head with the butt part of the gun. He's like, "If you don't stop, I'll shoot you," But he saw Chris getting tighter and tighter grip on his neck, and he's like, "He's going to kill me," and he ended up shooting him. It's terrible.
Yeah, it certainly is. It's a sad way to go. And, Chris Adams, another guy, there's a lot of what ifs. If he had been more reliable, I'm certainly someone who thinks he could have been a major, major star throughout the rest of the decade and into the 90s, just because he had the talent, he had the look, he had the charisma. From a creative point of view, Jeanie, do you know if did he enjoy being a heel or a babyface better?
A heel, 100%. And he was really upset too, because he'd gone to WCW, and I remember him being at my house, and he was sort of being a jobber, I think, not being used too well. And then he goes, about as much as he didn't like it, he said, "I need the money," so it's a regular paycheck. But it was a cause of frustration. So he had a lot of frustrations then right before he died with his lawsuit, and he was trying to work a deal out with his lawyer, because he phoned me in England 3 weeks before he died, and he said, "You know what?" He said, "I might be deported, and I'm okay with that, rather than go to jail." And he said he was going to possibly try and start up a wrestling school in the UK, and those were his plans, of his hopes of being deported, because he thought that was better than a manslaughter charge or whatever. So so he asked me if I could loan him some money to because he had literally nothing. He was penniless.
Yeah, it's so sad. And, shortly after Gino dies, you end up starting a business of novelty telegrams. And that was one of the interesting things about the book. I didn't know anything about Jeanie, the businesswoman. And I got to find out just how successful you were as a businesswoman in the Dallas area. What was that like for you, having that company? Jeanie's, I believe it was.
Jeanie's, yeah. Well, see, after Gino died, one of my friends, she would do, there's a company called Eastern Onion, and she would do these little skits. They were all in good taste. There wasn't any sort of nudity or anything like that. They were all in good taste. And she would say, it took her about 12 minutes, and she said, I'll just go up and do these. And I thought, how easy a job is that? And so I started my own Yellow Page ad, and I ended up with 10 employees and a really successful business. And I had that business right up until Steve and I sold it when Steve and I went to WCW.
On the topic of Steve, you brought it up earlier, somewhere around 1989, you get a phone call from Chris, and he tells you he has this idea of something he wants to do, and he has this student, Steve Williams, and he wants to do this angle that he tried to get you to do actually in 85 when they put Nicola Roberts as Andrea the Lady Giant with Gino. This is something he was thinking about even back then. So now he finally has the opportunity, and at this point, you say yes. Why did you agree to it at this time?
Well, it was just, if you think about it, I used to sometimes go to the Sportatorium as a guest of Chris and Tony prior to the angle, and it was only to be a Friday night, and they did the tapings on a Saturday morning. So it was like a little break and a bit of fun, if you want, because, I was doing telegrams all the time. Because I had 10 employees, I could delegate the shows to my employees. And I thought, hey, it sounds like a little bit of a change of pace for me. So I agreed to it, and I thought it would be fun. Honestly, it's just fun. Something fun to do different on a Friday night and Saturday morning, because there wasn't any road, going on the road at that time. It was just going to the Sportatorium, which took me like 15 minutes to get there. So, it wasn't anything. I could still go to work Saturday night and still get all my shows covered. So, yeah, I just did it because it was going to be a laugh.
And at that time, what is a young Steve Williams, later Steve Austin, what is he like? He's fresh out of wrestling school, had just been trained by Chris. He grew up in the area, loving world-class wrestling. What was he like?
He was really humble, very polite, and we were just friends. And when I would go to the Sportatorium, or the first time I met him, I was like, because he didn't really have a lot to say. But before the match, we would go into Chris's office or Jerry Jarrett's office, and we would discuss the match. And slowly I'd be like, "How are you? And how was your week?" And he would talk to me, and then we would do the interviews, and they would make us laugh, and we became really good friends. But he was really humble, extremely, and hardworking, and we built up a good friendship, to be honest. We were only friends for months. We didn't date. I'd say for about 4 or 5 months, we'd just be friendly. And then basically Chris had his own promotion called LNA Promotion he did with Tom Lance. And one day, because I didn't like to work spot shows, being as the money I would make on my telegrams would be so much more. Like I said, I only went on a Friday night for fun. But Chris really asked me to do this, and I said, well, I think it was in Louisiana. And I said, well, that's a long way to go for me. I don't know, how to get there, etc. He said, no worries. He said, give Steve a call, or Bronco was going. And I phoned Steve up, and I said, look, I will do this spot show, but could I ride with you in Bronco? And I was, yeah, sure, no problem. So what happened was Steve and Bronco, and I think it was someone else, but I can't remember who now, we all went out there, and we went out for dinner that night, and I kind of got the impression Steve liked me more than just a friend by then. So a romance, sort of in the early stages of a romance. But I didn't really, expect him to like me, but I knew he did.
I have a little bit of an offbeat question here. One of the most popular personalities on my show ever is Mark Gullene, and he was wrestling in Dallas as part of Beauty and the Beast with Terry Garvin Sims. Do you have any memories of that team or of Mark Gullene?
No, I know Terry, but I don't think they were working the same time as me.
Okay.
Although I knew Terry because he would often come to the apartment, Chris's apartment. Matter of fact, he would be a hairdresser, I believe, and he used to cut my daughter's hair. But I don't remember Beauty and the Beast because they wasn't working, I don't think, at the same time. It might have been a bit just before.
I believe Terry contributed some quotes to your book, as did Jerry Jarrett, who you mentioned earlier. You work for Jerry Jarrett at this time when you're doing this angle with Chris and Steve and Tony. And later on, and I didn't know this, he offered you the spot as Nanny Simpson in 1993, which would end up being Tony Adams in a feud with Tony and Chris Adams and Brian Christopher, a three-way little feud there. But what was your relationship like with Jerry Jarrett, and what was he like to work for?
I got along really well with Jerry, and he used to encourage me, and I would, get really good advice from him. I thought he was a really nice guy. He did call me when I was in Atlanta after I was Lady Blossom, and I was married and obviously had kids, and he phoned me up and he suggested the Nanny Simpson angle, and it wouldn't have worked out with Steve and my being a mom at this point, going to Nashville or Memphis. And I said, Jerry, I tell you what, you should call Toni Adams. And he goes, yeah, do you have a number? And I went, yeah, I do. And she was ecstatic, to do that. She really wanted to do that. So I was glad she could.
In the couples feud, you and Tony, and I'm going to, make a guess here, you guys, neither one of you had any training, were just out there beating the hell out of each other. Were there any injuries that ever arose just because you guys were wailing away at each other? And also, looking back on that feud, which was a long and memorable feud, what are your favorite moments in that feud?
Well, Tony and I were really good friends, and people thought it was a real shoot because I was the real life ex of Chris. But we really didn't hurt each other. It might have looked like we did, but we didn't. And the Tony was dying to come in, and Chris kept saying, no, we're going to wait 2 or 3 months because they wanted to get the crowd to really hate me. But I think one of the most favorite things is finally Tony comes down and she whacks me and I go down, and the pop we got was amazing. And then the only injury I really got within that feud was when Chris told me to pick up the iron bar, the one that you hit the bell with.
Yeah.
And he said, if you hold it this way, just hit me on the side of the neck here. And I was so worried about hurting him, I broke my hand, literally. and I remember it went blue. And I remember Steve saying, no, be all right, just put some ice on it. It'd be all right. So I'm like, didn't go to the hospital. And then I said, I can't actually move my fingers, and it got worse and worse. I saw him the next week, and maybe we better take you to the hospital. And the x-ray showed that the bone had snapped in half, and I had a cast on and some of the latter part of that angle.